Welcome to the wonderful fantasy world. Subscribe now. The Mark of the Two Snakes, The Rebirth of the God, Slayer. Volume 1, The Awakening of the Blood Oath. Chapter 15, The Spiritual Vein Symbiote. The wind in the misty wasteland swept blood-colored leaves across the gear graveyard. Aiden followed Mara's snaketail as they made their way through the metal debris. The sound of his boots rubbing against the gears formed an eerie harmony with the moaning of the petrified ancient tree in the distance. When he stepped on a gear rack covered with moss, the ground suddenly trembled. Countless roots burst out from the cracks, and spiral gear patterns flowed on the surface of the roots, resembling a solidified spiritual vein river. This is the gear root. Mara's tail tip gently touched the root, and a few tiny sparks flew as her scales rubbed against the metal. A symbiote cultivated by the aliens using Vera's spiritual vein technology. It can independently absorb the residual spiritual veins in the air. She looked up into the depths of the mist, where a building woven from gears and roots stood. The Nest of Symbiosis, the last stronghold built by the aliens during the Eternal Silence disaster. The gear-shaped door at the entrance of the nest opened automatically. Aiden's jade pendant suddenly became hot, and the red snake spiritual light seeping from the cracks resonated with the double snake totem on the door. The nest master who greeted them was an ember spirit. Gear-shaped spiritual veins flowed within his semi-transparent body, and a half-piece of the snake-headed sword fragment was embedded in his chest. Exactly the weapon that broke during the duel of the two snakes in Chapter 8 of the prequel. Blood of the God, Slayer. The Ember Spirit's voice was like rocks rubbing together. The last time I saw such spiritual light was when Vera watered the wasteland with her spiritual veins. He raised his hand, and a blood-colored projection appeared on the wall. On the misty wasteland 100 years ago, Vera knelt on one knee, and the red snake spiritual light spread like roots. Withered gears sprouted new branches and leaves in her palm. She taught us to coexist with the gears instead of being devoured by them. Aiden's blood-red eyes suddenly stung, and a scene from Chapter 2 of the prequel flashed in his vision. By the bonfire of the snake tribe, Vera handed a human a spiritual vein wine in a red snake pottery cup. The starry sky reflected on the bottom of the cup overlapped with the gear patterns on the roots in front of him. When he touched the root, the blood-colored patterns suddenly converged into the shape of two snakes. The Ember Spirit's pupils contracted into vertical slits like a snake's. This is the double snake symbiosis mark. Back then, Vera injected the rhythm of gears into the soil with her spiritual veins, and then these self-repairing roots came into being. The spiritual vein liquid seeping from the root condensed into a gear shape in Aiden's palm, and its temperature was astonishingly similar to his mother's body temperature before her death. Mara explained in a low voice. During the Eternal Silence disaster, the aliens created these symbiotes using Vera's blood oath technology. Gears are no longer the shackles that imprison spiritual veins, but the conduits that guide the flow of spiritual veins. She lashed her tail, pointing to the gear workshop in the distance. The hawk-headed tribe craftsmen were waking up the stone elements with songs and driving the gears to grind spiritual vein ores. We can survive without gear spell imprints. Suddenly, a rumble of turning gears came from the ground. 3 church gear war puppets rushed out of the mist, and the Eternal Silence 09 number at their joints was particularly eye-catching in Aiden's blood-red eyes. Aiden instinctively raised his snake-shaped wrench, but the red snake spiritual light was absorbed by the roots when it touched the war puppets, and instead, red snake patterns emerged on the gear hearts. The Ember Spirit exclaimed, "They're absorbing your spiritual light." These war puppets use Loren's spiritual vein siphon core. The muzzles of the war puppets aimed at the entrance of the nest. Aiden suddenly had an inspiration and pressed his palm on the nearest root. The blood-colored patterns spread along the gear-shaped roots. The gear hearts of the war puppets wailed, and the church emblems on their surfaces gradually peeled off, revealing the double, snake, and twining pattern underneath. Exactly the core symbol of Loren's design drawing in Chapter 3 of the prequel. What they're afraid of is not the aliens. Aiden's voice was mixed with the tremor of the roots. It's the truth that gears and spiritual veins are supposed to coexist. The war puppets crashed to the ground, and a half piece of parchment fell out of their chests. Aiden recognized it as the remaining pages of the research log of the Mark of the Two Snakes, stolen by his parents in Chapter 11 of the prequel. The gear disassembly diagram on the edge was exactly the same as the spiral of the root. The Ember Spirit picked up the paper and his transparent palm passed through the words. Back then, Loren stole Vera's spiritual vein research, but the church claimed that the aliens plundered the spiritual veins. He looked up, and the double snake patterns on the root were reflected in his eyes. In fact, we should have known long ago that gears and spiritual veins should be intertwined like a snake and a gear, coexisting. Mara suddenly hissed, and her snake pupils stared intently at the core of the war puppet. That's a fragment of Vera's spiritual vein crystal. Loren used it to make the siphon cannon back then, and now the church uses it to drive the war puppets ... double quotes. The tip of her tail rolled up the fragment, and the red snake pottery cup resonated immediately. The blood pattern at the bottom of the cup coincided with the spell text on the fragment. These fragments are absorbing your blood, Aiden. They're restarting the early experiments of the Divine Throne. Aiden's temples throbbed. Memory fragments misshed like gears. In the Blood Fire Siege in Chapter 4 of the prequel, the siphoned aliens turned into stone statues, with gear patterns covering their skin. In the Gallows Square in Chapter 3, the snake-shaped birthmark on the boy's back glowed faintly in the moonlight. He suddenly understood that the church's so-called spiritual vein thieves were just a cover-up for Loren's plunder of spiritual veins back then. Try using the frequency of the silver snake gears. The voice of the remnant soul Vera sounded in the jade pendant. This was the first time she took the initiative to give a hint. Loren's mechanical heart was hidden in such a symbiote back then. Aiden closed his eyes and breathed using the gear tuning method his father had taught him. The silver snake patterns on his arm resonated in sync with the red snake's spiritual light for the first time. The root suddenly beeped, and a shriek of Loren's mechanical palm emerged on the crystal fragment in the core of the war puppet. Nice imitation, the shriek laughed with a sound like gears rubbing. But the gears of the Divine Throne have already inscribed your fates. Aiden Blood Oath, the 7th generation vessel of the Mark of the Two Snakes. The Shuying turned to the Ember Spirit. Do you think that by cultivating roots with Vera's spiritual veins, you can resist the Divine Throne? She volunteered to be imprisoned by me back then so that you aliens could learn to coexist with the gears ... Mara's snake tail suddenly lashed out at the Shuying, but it passed through the mechanical palm and hit the gear totem behind. The totem shattered, revealing the entrance to a secret chamber behind it. The walls of the chamber were engraved with the symbiosis ceremony diagrams of the previous Divine Throne experiment, exactly the same as the spiritual vein ceremony in Chapter 2 of the prequel. Aiden's blood-red eyes saw that the double snake gear in the center of the diagram was the materialization of the mark on his chest. He's lying. The Ember Spirit's body flickered with anger. When Vera was in prison, she entrusted her human lover to take out the snake, the tribe's sacred object. In your jade pendant, her last spiritual vein command is sealed. He pointed to the blood-colored flower at the top of the root. These flowers will bloom when the blood of the God Slayer approaches, just like now. Aiden took off the jade pendant. The moment the red snake's spiritual light overflowing from the cracks touched the flower, the roots of the entire nest of symbiosis glowed in sync. He saw the memories of 100 years ago. Before being petrified, Vera injected her spiritual veins into the land, and Loren's gear spell imprint technology was distorted into symbiotic patterns in her pool of blood. It turned out that the church's blood-colored gear spell imprints were originally the spiritual vein interfaces she left for humans. Loren wanted to devour the spiritual veins, while Vera wanted to share them. Mara's voice was uncharacteristically gentle. Their Mark of the Two Snakes is two sides of the same coin, representing symbiosis and plunder. The tip of her tail rolled up a gear-shaped leaf. Now you know why the church wants to kill all the aliens, right? They're afraid that we'll reveal the truth, the human gear spell. Imprints have been flowing with alien spiritual veins from the very beginning. The rumble of the church fleet's gears came from the distance. The Ember Spirit suddenly turned into spiritual vein light spots and emerged into the roots. Take our symbiotes to the mechanical divine palace, Aiden Blood Oath. Let those who engrave lies with gears see what the spiritual veins really look like. The roots automatically split into gear-shaped seedlings, and each leaf was engraved with the name of an alien, corresponding one by one to the list of Snake Tribe elders harvested in Chapter 4 of the prequel. Aiden tightly held the jade pendant, feeling the red and silver spiritual lights flowing in his body. He finally understood why his father engraved the double snake pattern in the blacksmith shop, and why his mother was willing to expose her spiritual veins on the execution rack. They were not avoiding the curse, but guarding the symbiotic spark left by Vera. When the first gear seedling took root in his palm, the blood-colored patterns and the silver snake gears naturally intertwined for the first time, forming a more beautiful symbiotic totem than the church's spell imprints. Mara, Aiden looked at the Snaketail tribe leader who was collecting the spiritual vein liquid. His double snake mark was reflected on the surface of the pottery cup. The church says the aliens are spiritual vein thieves, but the real thieves are those who make the gears forget who they should turn for. He pointed to the approaching church fleet. The gear armors glimmered with a cold light in the mist. They stole the possibility of spiritual vein symbiosis, but forged chains of hatred with lies. Mara nodded, and Aiden's figure was reflected in her snake pupils. That's why Vera engraved the mark into the bloodline, so that everyone with the blood of the two snakes can choose the meaning of the gears. She handed the pottery cup to Aiden. The blood pattern at the bottom of the cup coincided with his mark. Now, are you going to become the new vessel of the divine throne, or make the gears truly belong to every life? The church's searchlights tore through the mist. Aiden pressed the gear seedling onto the core of the war puppet, and the blood-colored spiritual light spread like rust. The originally cold mechanical heart actually began to sprout branches and leaves. His blood-red eyes saw that above the head of each gear soldier, the gear cracks representing death were being filled by the newly born spiritual vein patterns. It turned out that the true power of the Godslayer was not to destroy the gears, but to make the gears a fertile soil for the growth of spiritual veins. The roots of the nest of symbiosis suddenly grew taller, forming a blood-colored barrier to block the church's spiritual vein cannons. Aiden saw that the names of all the victims of the previous Divine Throne experiment emerged on the surface of the roots, including his mother's experimental subject number, WL07. When the first shell hit the barrier, the spiritual vein liquid seeping from the roots condensed into a double snake totem in the air. It was the true contract of gears and blood that Vera had guarded with her life. Let's go. Aiden tightly grabbed Mara's arm. The gear seedling was hot in his palm. To the mechanical divine palace, and let them see what kind of flowers the spiritual veins they crushed can bloom. When he turned around, the spiritual light overflowing from the cracks of the jade pendant swept across the gear graveyard. Millions of gears engraved with names trembled simultaneously, as if countless undead were crying out silently in the mist. Mara's snake tail rolled up the last gear-shaped leaf, clearly engraved with Irene Blood, Oath, Aiden's mother's name. She suddenly chuckled. Do you know why Vera's blood can make the gears rust? Because only rusty gears can grow new patterns. She looked at the gradually dissipating church fleet. And your blood, Aiden, will make these patterns a bridge connecting the two pieces. Aiden touched the mark on his chest. It was no longer a burning pain, but resonating at the same frequency as the gear roots, the spiritual vein liquid, and even the heartbeat of the petrified ancient tree in the distance. He finally understood that the mark of the two snakes was never a curse, but a symbiotic seed buried in blood and fire by two idealists 100 years ago. Now this seed was germinating in his hands and was about to bloom with a bloody hope that would subvert the whole world in the church's gear maze. When they left the nest of symbiosis, the gear roots automatically weaved into a boat, carrying Aiden and Mara into the depths of the mist. Behind them, the gear-shaped spiritual vein lamps lit up one by one, outlining a light belt of two snakes entwining on the wasteland. This was the truth that the aliens had guarded with 100 years of blood and tears. Gears and spiritual veins should never be in a relationship of plunder and being plundered, but should be intertwined like two snakes, always retaining the possibility of choosing symbiosis in the cycle of destruction and rebirth. This episode ends here. The next episode will be more exciting. Subscribe now.